Good morning, it's Dr. Calatrello. I know by now you must be thinking, are we going to read this entire book? We're not. I wish that we did have some time to go into some other aspects of fiction, like point of view, setting, and so forth. But at my back, I always hear Time's winged chariot. There's your homework. Find out where that comes from. So today, the good news is we just have a few very short slides, I promise. And this is on, I think, a pretty important and a pretty interesting aspect of literature, and that is symbolism. So let's go through just a couple slides. I think I've got five slides on symbolism, okay? Okay, so a literary symbol is simply something that means more than what it is. It can be an object, it can be a person, a situation, even action can take on symbolic value. Or some other item that has a literal meaning in the story, but suggests or represents other meanings as well. And I think that's one of the key qualities of a literary symbol, is that the literary symbol has to serve a purpose in the story. So it has to function at the literal level. It has to make organic common sense in the story. But it can also take on larger, more abstract significance to it, with some reflection and maybe some imagination and just a little bit of experience. In literature, there are certainly some universal symbols that we can keep an eye out for, and we're probably already familiar with. If you think about it, think about rain, and by extension water. Rain and water typically, what do you think that they typically symbolize? What could rain and water symbolize to us? Often, and throughout history, especially in literature, rain and water usually will symbolize rebirth, right? Or recreation, renewal, and recreation in the truest sense of the word, in the idea that you are being recreated. In literature, and this holds true in movies and in television shows as well. Anytime, or I shouldn't say anytime, but oftentimes, if you watch a movie and you've watched a very emotionally intense scene, and a character has just gone through something very intense, see how often it will start to rain on the character. That's not by mistake. That's because there's a symbolic value to it. It's the idea that the character is being baptized, being renewed, being regenerated by the restorative and the recreative powers of water. So as human beings, we, I think, are certainly, we're wired, I think, in a certain way, to pick up and to use and to be moved by actions and by things that imbue our experience with some kind of larger symbolic value. Symbolism as a literary device is a technique that writers can use to achieve compression in their stories. And I don't think that your text talks much about this, but or if it talks about it at all, really. But if you think about it, symbolism is particularly useful for writers of short fiction. And when I say short fiction, I mean usually short stories. Because writers of short stories generally don't have the luxury of developing their characters, their plots, and their themes over hundreds of pages, the way that a novelist would. Okay? And so, because the whole form, the genre itself, is short, by using and utilizing key symbols in a story, it can help communicate the theme, help reveal the theme of the story in a much more direct and maybe in a much more useful way for readers. Okay, remember that. Of course, novelists can go on, right? And compression is also sometimes something we talk about when we talk about poetry too, because the poet, and we'll talk about that in another learning unit. But poetry as a genre too is ultimate compression, right? I mean, with very few words, a poet can communicate just as much meaning and just as much emotion as a lengthy novel. So symbolism again is something that writers can use usually in short fiction. Oh, and your book does talk about this, and I think that it's worth noting here too. Symbols aren't hidden in stories. Okay, an author doesn't think to himself or herself, "I'm going to hide things from my reader." That's just not the way. That's not the way they go about their craft. They're not hidden. Instead, if the writer has done a good job, if the writer is a true artist, the symbols are woven and embedded into the very texture of the story, subtly. They're not always going to hit you over the head with them, but they're not trying to. I think it's a mistake that students and sometimes not very sophisticated readers maybe think that the writer's trying to hide something from you, and that it's your job to dig it out. That's not the way that's not the way the art works, I don't think. But symbolism can certainly enhance our understanding of the story's theme, and we'll talk about theme in another presentation here very soon. Symbols are very interesting things. They can change. Their meanings can change depending on who's reading the story too. So there's a certain ambiguity, a certain elusiveness to symbols. I don't know if you were ever forced to read The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, which if you were forced to read it, I apologize. You should probably read it when you have time and when you've grown up and you're not in ninth grade anymore. I think they have to. I think students in here read it in the ninth grade, which is just the absolute worst time in the world to try to read anything, especially The Scarlet Letter. The Scarlet Letter is probably the most famous literary symbol, probably the most well-known and widely read symbolic novel in American literature. It's the first truly symbolic novel all the way through. And of course, it's about Hester Prynne and Reverend Dimmesdale and the secret sin, and then the offspring, right? But we know the storyline, right? And Hester is forced to wear the scarlet letter, the red A, which she wears on her bosom. And but does Hawthorne or Hawthorne's narrator ever tell you what the letter A stands for in the novel? Think about that, because the short answer is no. He never says that A means adultery, and so depending on any number of things, the scarlet letter can symbolize different things. And the scarlet letter itself begins to symbolize different things, not only for us as readers, but for Hester herself as she grows throughout the novel. So while it is initially given to her to wear as a punitive measure to bring about and to illustrate and symbolize her shame, to this Puritan culture she finds herself in, it does change, and it does transform her character in a significant way, and in a way that's not shameful. So think about that next time you pick up The Scarlet Letter. We can talk more about that too. It's a fine novel. It really is, and I'll just give you. It's really the best crafted novel of the 19th century, and so I encourage you to pick it up again too. Again, you are all out of ninth grade now, and you are all now sophisticated readers, so it's time to pick it up. Characters' names can sometimes take on symbolic value. So you need to remember that authors always can choose their characters' names, right? And so characters will often utilize names to, again, embed and weave into the story something, again, to achieve compression, right? To increase and to enhance, I think, our understanding of the character, and oftentimes his or her conflict, and then ultimately the theme that's revealed. So characters' names certainly can have symbolic value. If you think, for example, of Alice Walker's story Everyday Use, the action of Dee changing her name from Dee to Wanjero or Wangero, however one wants to pronounce it, that the action of her leaving one name behind and taking on another name, that action has symbolic value, doesn't it? It's something she does, so there's a literal action in the story, but it represents, it signifies, it suggests something larger. In fact, it symbolizes her perspective on her heritage and her changing perception of her heritage. But if we think about Eudora Welty's story, A Worn Path, which is just a fabulous, fabulous story. Phoenix Jackson, her name has is imbued with significant symbolic value. If you don't know the story of the Phoenix, then I encourage you to Google it and then reread the story. Because again, you can read the story and you know the character's name is Phoenix Jackson, and so one can have have one reading of the story without knowing anything about the Phoenix story, but if one is familiar with the mythology of the Phoenix, then one can come back to the story and can begin to read through it again, watching Phoenix as she makes her regular journey. And then that second level of reading is a more satisfying reading, I think. So that's why it's really great to know stuff, you guys. That's why it's important, and why, as educated people, we want to expose ourselves to as many stories as possible. Because one of the things that we find is that sometimes, and I know I'm going on now, but I get excited sometimes because sometimes authors and stories are actually in dialogue with one another. Okay. So you read one story, and it may trigger a memory of something else you've read, and then all of a sudden there's a strange kind of dynamic action, a connection, an imaginative connection, intellectual connection between two authors and two stories. And the one can enhance our understanding of the other. And that's just a really, really exciting thing. And that's why, as I say, it's great to know stuff. So, where was I? A character's names. Yes, they can have symbolic value. I'm a big John Steinbeck fan, okay? Steinbeck also utilized his names of his characters to achieve, again, for the reader a more rich experience. For example, in his story, The Grapes of Wrath, there is an itinerant preacher whose name is Jim Casey. Okay, so Jim Casey is a preacher who is working among the migrant workers and working to motivate their spirits and keep their optimism together as they are looking for work. And Jim Casey is ultimately viewed as a threat as a danger. And Jim Casey is ultimately martyred for this cause. And so it doesn't take it doesn't take a rocket scientist, right, to figure out that Jim Casey's initials are JC, and he was somebody who preached, and somebody who inspired people, and somebody who was persecuted, and somebody who was ultimately martyred. So there's one example of Steinbeck doing that, but he did it in other stories and in other novels too. East of Eden's a fantastic example of that as well. The East of Eden story again has certain biblical, obvious biblical, symbolic uses of names. The main character's name is Adam. Gee, Adam in a novel called East of Eden, right? And so the patriarch of this family's name is Adam Trask. Gosh, he has two sons, right? And one's name is Caleb, and the other's name is Aaron. So you can see that while he doesn't name them Cain and Abel, he names them with letters that suggest or symbolize, right, something larger. These biblical characters that we're all familiar with, Cain and Abel. And of the two brothers, one is evil and one is good. And, again, you don't have to be a rocket scientist or an English professor to figure this out, that Caleb in the story is the evil character, and his brother Aaron is the other character who is good. So names, guys, always be on the lookout for names and the symbolic value that they may possess. And again, the great thing about it is that you can read a story and not lock in, not identify these symbols, and that's okay. And you can have a reading experience with the story or with the novel or with the movie. But again, when you are familiar with things because you read and you're educated, you can begin to have, I think, more, for me at least, more satisfying experiences reading, and so keep a lookout for those names, and think about what you're going to name your kids too. They have to live with those names for a long time. So I spent a lot of time just talking about the symbolic value of names, but certainly the objects and the actions that we see in the stories that we're going to be reading have symbolic value too. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but I want you to be thinking about possible symbolic interpretations of some things as you read. So when you read Welty's story, A Worn Path, think about that path that Phoenix traverses regularly to retrieve that medicine for her grandson. What is that path? What does that symbolize to you? Think about Miss Brill and that fur of hers, or those cupboards and cabinets that she opens. Think about the quilts in everyday use, and what do they seem to symbolize? Do they symbolize the same things to different characters, to the same characters, or do different characters view those quilts differently? And how do you view the quilts? What's their importance? Think about the hand-shaped birthmark in Hawthorne's story, The Birthmark. I mean, think about the cranes in Meinke's story. What's another good example? Tobias Wolff in his story, That Room, right? That room's a place. It's a literal place, but there's something else, I think, that room begins to symbolize for readers as well. So maybe these are ideas we can take to the discussion board, and maybe we can share some of the ideas and discuss them, because again, that's one of the great things about literature, is coming together with people who have read the same thing and talking about it and exchanging ideas. So I'm going to let you go here, and I'll see you the next time, okay? So in the interim, be kind to one another, and I hope that you're enjoying the class so far. I hope that you're enjoying the reading, and that you're finding things satisfactory. If you've got questions about the class, about the material, always know that you can contact me, that you can send me a message on Blackboard, that you can call the office, you can come by. And that's one of my favorite things about teaching, is working with students. And with distance ed, I don't always get to work as closely with students as I do in my American Lit classes, which are still traditional classes. And so I hope to see you soon, and if I don't, then well, I guess I won't see you. But I hope we meet sometime.